Book 2. How the psychological characteristics of races are displayed in the various elements of their civilizations. Chapter 1. The various elements of civilization considered as an exterior manifestation of the soul of a people. The elements of which a civilization is composed are the exterior manifestations of the soul of the peoples which have created them. The importance of these various elements varies with the different peoples. According to the several peoples, it is the arts, literature, institutions, etc. that fill the fundamental role. Examples from antiquity: the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. The evolution of the different elements of a civilization may be independent of the general march of that civilization. Examples supplied by the arts: what they express, impossibility of finding in a single element of a civilization the measure of the level of that civilization, elements which assure the superiority of a people, elements which philosophically are very inferior may be socially very superior. The different elements, languages, institutions, ideas, beliefs, arts, literature, of which a civilization is composed, should be regarded as the exterior manifestation of the soul of the men who have created them. The importance, however, of these elements as the expression of the soul of a people varies greatly with the period and the races. Few books relating to works of art appear at the present day that do not contain the statement that works of art are the faithful rendering of the thought of peoples and the most important expression of their civilization. Doubtless it is often true that this is the case, but the rule is a long way from being absolute, and the development of the arts is far from corresponding invariably to the intellectual development of nations. While there are certain peoples for whom works of art are the most important manifestation of their soul, there are others who occupy, moreover, a high rank in the scale of civilization, among whom the arts have played but a very secondary part. If the history of the civilization of each people had to be written on the understanding that only one of its elements was to be considered, the element chosen ought to vary in the case of each people. For some peoples the element would be the arts, but for others it would be their institutions, their military organization, their industry, their commerce, etc., that would give the best knowledge of them. It is important to establish this point at the outset, for it will enable us later to understand how it is that the various elements of a civilization have undergone very unequal transformations when transmitted from one people to another. Among the peoples of antiquity, the Egyptians and Romans offer highly characteristic examples of this inequality in the development of the various elements of a civilization, and even in the various branches of which each of these elements is composed. Let us begin by considering the Egyptians. Their literature was always very weak, their painting of very poor quality. In architecture and statuary, on the contrary, they produced masterpieces. Their monuments will excite our admiration. The Egyptian statues that have come down to us, the scribe, the Sheikh al-Beled, Rahotep, Nefertari, and many others, would still be models at the present day, and it was only during a very short period that they were surpassed by the Greeks. With the Egyptians let us compare the Romans, whose role in history was so preponderating. They lacked neither educators nor models, since they came after the Egyptians and Greeks, and yet they did not succeed in creating a personal art. No people, perhaps, has ever displayed less originality in its artistic productions. The Romans held the arts in very slight esteem, scarcely regarding them from other than a utilitarian point of view, and looking on them merely as a sort of imported article, analogous to the other products, such as metals, aromatics, and spices, for which they were indebted to foreign peoples. At the period when they were already masters of the world, the Romans had no national art, and even later on, when universal peace, wealth, and the needs of luxury somewhat developed their weak artistic sentiments, it was always to Greece that they went for models and artists. The history of Roman architecture and sculpture is scarcely more than an appendix to the history of the sculpture and architecture of Greece. On the other hand, this great Roman people, which was so inferior in the arts, developed three other elements of civilization to the highest pitch. It possessed military institutions, which ensured it the empire of the world, political and juridical institutions which still serve us as models, and finally it created a literature which for centuries has been the source of inspiration of our own. We thus have a striking example of the unequal development of the elements of a civilization in the case of two nations whose high degree of culture cannot be contested, and we can divine the errors that would result from taking as sole standard but one of these elements, the arts for example. We have just found that among the Egyptians the arts, with the exception of painting, were extremely original and remarkable, while literature, on the contrary, did not rise above mediocrity. Among the Romans the arts were mediocre and without a trace of originality, but they shone in the field of literature, and their military and political institutions were of the highest order. The Greeks themselves, though one of the peoples that has displayed the most superiority in the most different fields, may also be cited in proof of the unequal way in which the development of the various elements of the civilization proceeds. At the Homeric epoch their literature was already very brilliant, since the songs of Homer are still regarded as the models with which the students of the European universities are condemned to saturate themselves, a view that has been taken for centuries past. But the discoveries of modern archaeology have proved that, at the period to which the Homeric songs belong, Greek sculpture and architecture were grossly barbarian and confined to crude imitations of Egyptian and Assyrian art. However, it is more especially the Hindus that furnish us with an example of the unequal development of the different elements of a civilization. As regards architecture, they have been surpassed by very few peoples. As regards philosophy, the depth of their speculations has only been attained to by European thought at a quite recent date. In literature, if they do not reach the level of the Greeks and Latins, they have nevertheless produced admirable work. Their statuary, on the contrary, is mediocre, and much below that of the Greeks. In the domain of science and in that of historical knowledge they have absolutely nothing to show, and they exhibit an absence of precision that is not met with to an equal degree in any other people. Their sciences have been mere childish speculations, their histories absurd legends, containing not a single exact date and probably not a single exact event. In their case, once again, the exclusive study of the arts would be insufficient to determine the level of their civilization. Many other examples might be adduced in support of what precedes. There are races which, although they have never occupied an absolutely superior rank, have succeeded in creating an absolutely personal art bearing no visible relation to anterior models. The Arabs are a case in point. Less than a century after they had invaded the old Greco-Roman world, they had so utterly transformed the Byzantine architecture they had begun by adopting, that it would be impossible to determine the types that had inspired them, if it were not that we are still able to consult the series of intermediary monuments. Moreover, even if a people should not possess any artistic or literary aptitude, it is capable of creating a civilization of a superior order. This happened in the case of the Phoenicians, whose sole superiority was their skill in commerce. It was they who civilized the ancient world by bringing all its parts into communication. But as far as they themselves were concerned, they produced scarcely anything, and the history of their civilization is the history of their commerce. Finally, there are peoples among whom all the elements of civilization have remained in an inferior state, with the exception of the arts. The Mongolians were a people of this kind. The monuments they raised in India, in a style about which there is scarcely anything Hindu, are so magnificent that competent artists declare that some of them rank among the most beautiful monuments that have been raised by the hand of man, and yet nobody could think of classing the Mongols among the superior races. It will be noticed, moreover, that even among the most civilized peoples, it is not always at the culminating period of their civilization that the arts attain to the highest degree of development. Among the Egyptians and among the Hindus the most perfect monuments are generally the most ancient, while in Europe it was in the Middle Ages, an epoch regarded as semi-barbarian, that flourished that marvellous Gothic art whose admirable productions have never been equalled. In consequence, it is quite impossible to judge of the level of a people solely by the development of its arts, which constitute, I repeat, but one of the elements of its civilization, and an element whose superiority is not proven any more than the superiority of literature is proven. It often happens, on the contrary, that it is among the peoples at the head of civilization, the Romans for instance, in ancient times, and the Americans at the present day, that artistic productions show the most weakness. Frequently, too, as we just remarked, it has been in semi-barbarous ages that the peoples have produced their literary and artistic masterpieces. Their artistic masterpieces more especially. It would even seem that the period of personality in the arts, in the case of a people, is a growth belonging to its childhood or its youth, and not to its maturity. And if it be considered that among the utilitarian preoccupations of the new world of which we catch a glimpse of the dawn, the role of the arts is scarcely observable, we may foresee the day when they will be classed, if not among the inferior, at least among the quite secondary manifestations of a civilization. There are many reasons why the progress of the arts in their evolution should not be parallel to that of the other elements of a civilization, and should not in consequence be always a sure indication of the state of this civilization. Whether in the case of Egypt, of Greece, or of the various European peoples, we observe this general law that as soon as art has reached a certain level, as soon that it is as certain masterpieces have been produced, there immediately commences a period of decadence entirely independent of the movement of the other elements of the civilization. This decadent phase of the arts subsists until a political revolution, an invasion, the adoption of new beliefs, or any other factor introduces new elements into art. It was in this way that in the Middle Ages the Crusades were the source of fresh knowledge and new ideas which gave an impulsion to art that resulted in the transformation of the Roman style into the Gothic style. It was in this way again that several centuries later the revival of Greek and Latin studies brought about the transformation of Gothic art into the art of the Renaissance. In India too, the Mussulman invasions caused the transformation of Hindu art in precisely the same fashion. It is also of importance to observe that since the arts express in general fashion certain of the needs of civilization and correspond to certain sentiments, they are fated to undergo transformations in conformity with these needs, and even to disappear entirely if the needs and the sentiments which have given birth to them should themselves be transformed or disappear. It will in no wise follow, however, that the civilization is on this account in decadence. And here once more we are confronted with the absence of parallelism between the evolution of the arts and that of the other elements of a civilization. At no period in history has civilization been at so high a pitch as at the present day, and at no period perhaps has art been more commonplace and less personal. The religious beliefs, the ideas, and the needs which made art an essential element of civilization at the periods when it had temples and palaces for its sanctuaries having disappeared, art has become an accessory, an instrument of pleasure to which it is not possible to devote either much time or much money. Being no longer a necessity, it can scarcely escape being artificial and imitative. At the present day there are no longer peoples who possess a national art, and each people, in architecture as in sculpture, lives on more or less happy copies of the work of bygone epochs. These modest copies doubtless represent needs or caprices, but it is clear that it is impossible that they should express our modern ideas. I admire the naive works of our artists of the Middle Ages as seen in their paintings of saints, of Christ, of paradise and hell, all of which were of fundamental importance at the time and the principal concern of existence. But when painters who no longer entertain these beliefs cover our walls with primitive legends or childish symbols in an attempt to return to the technique of another age, they merely produce wretched imitations without interest for the present and destined to arouse contempt in the future. The only real arts, the only arts which are the expression of an epoch, are those in which the artist represents what he feels or what he sees instead of confining himself to the imitation of forms corresponding to needs or beliefs we have ceased to possess. The only sincere painting of the present day is that which reproduces the things by which we are surrounded, just as the only sincere architecture is that of the 5-storied house, the viaduct, and the railway station. This utilitarian art corresponds to the needs and ideas of our civilization. It is as characteristic of the epoch as were formerly the Gothic church and the feudal castle. For the archaeologist of the future, the great modern caravanseries and the old Gothic churches will be of equal interest, because they will be successive pages in those books of stone which each century leaves behind, while he will disdain as useless documents the sorry counterfeit copies of so many modern artists. Every aesthetic system represents the ideal of an epoch and of a race, and for the sole reason that epochs and races are different, the ideal must constantly be varying. From the philosophic point of view, all ideals are of equal worth, for they constitute more transitory symbols. The arts, then, like all the elements of civilization, are the exterior manifestation of the soul of the people that has created them. But we ought to recognize, however, that they are far from constituting, in the case of all peoples, the most exact manifestation of their thought. This demonstration was necessary, for the importance in the case of a given people of a given element of civilization is a measure of the power of transformation which that people brings to bear on the element in question when it borrows it from a foreign race. If its personality displays itself more especially in the arts, for example, its reproductions of imported models are sure to be deeply marked by its own imprint. On the contrary, it will transform but very slightly the elements that are incapable of serving to interpret its genius. When the Romans adopted the architecture of Greece, they did not make it the object of radical modifications, because they did not put what was most characteristic of their soul into their monuments. Still, even in the case of such a people as the Romans, who were without a personal architecture, and who were constrained to go to the foreigner for their models and their artists, art is obliged in the course of but few centuries to undergo the influence of environment and to become, almost in spite of itself, the expression of the race that has adopted it. The temples, palaces, triumphal arches, and bas-reliefs of ancient Rome are the work of Greeks or of pupils of the Greeks, and yet the character of these monuments, their destination, their ornaments, even their dimensions, do not arouse in us the delicate, poetic memories of the Athenian genius, but rather the ideas of force, of domination, and of military passion with which the mighty soul of Rome was imbued. Thus, even in the field in which it shows itself least personal, a race can accomplish nothing that does not bear some trace of the fact that it was due to its initiative, and without revealing something of its mental constitution and innermost thought. The explanation is that the true artist, whether architect or poet, possesses the magic faculty of expressing in his synthesis the soul of an epoch and of a race, very impressionable, very unconscious. Thinking more especially in images and reasoning but little, artists are at certain epochs the faithful mirrors of the society in which they live. Their works are the most exact documents to which recourse can be had with a view to evoking a vanished civilization. They are too unconscious not to be sincere, and too impressed by their surroundings not to give faithful expression to the ideas, sentiments, needs, and tendencies of their environment. They are not free to create what they choose, and the fact constitutes their strength. They are imprisoned in a network of traditions, ideas, and beliefs, the sum total of which constitutes the soul of a race and an epoch, the inheritance of sentiments, thoughts, and inspirations whose influence is all-powerful over them because it governs the obscure regions of the unconscious in which their works are elaborated. Were we without these works, and did we know nothing of the vanished centuries but what is related of them in the absurd narratives and artificial arrangements of the books of history, the real past of each people would be almost as great an enigma to us as that of the mysterious Atlantiades, submerged, according to Plato, by the waters. The essential characteristic, then, of the work of art is to be the sincere expression of the needs and ideas of the age that gives it birth. Of all the various languages which relate the story of the past, works of art, those of architecture in particular, are the most intelligible. More sincere than books, less artificial than religions and languages, they express both the sentiments and the needs of their period. The architect builds the dwelling places of men and those of the gods, and it was always within the precincts of the temple or those of the house that were elaborated the first causes of the events which constitute history. We may conclude from what precedes that while the various elements of which a civilization is composed are indeed the expression of the soul of the people that has created them, certain of these elements, though which of them varies with the races and also with the epochs in the case of the same race, are a more exact expression of the soul of a race than others. Since, however, the nature of these elements varies with the different peoples and the different epochs, it is evident that it is impossible to find a single element capable of serving as a common standard, whereby to gauge the level of the different civilizations. It is also evident that a hierarchical classification cannot be established among these elements, for the classification would vary from century to century, the importance of the elements considered varying itself with the periods. If the value of the diverse elements of a civilization were to be judged solely from the point of view of pure utility, it might be affirmed that the most important elements of a civilization are those which allow one people to subject another, that is to say, military institutions. But if this test were adopted, it would be necessary to rank the Greeks, a nation of artists, philosophers, and writers, after the Romans with their invincible cohorts, the virtuous and learned Egyptians after the semi-barbarian Persians, and the Hindus after the Mongols, who were also semi-barbarians. History is but little concerned with these subtle distinctions. The only superiority before which it always bows is military superiority, which is very rarely accompanied by a corresponding superiority in the other elements of civilization, or at least does not long allow the maintenance of its side of this latter superiority. Unfortunately, military superiority cannot decline among a people without that people being fated to disappear. It has always been when they had reached the apogee of civilization that the superior peoples have had to retire before barbarians, much their inferiors as regards intelligence, but possessing certain qualities of character and warlike aptitudes to which too refined civilizations have always been fatal. It is necessary in consequence to arrive at the saddening conclusion that it is the elements which, philosophically speaking, are inferior that are the most important from the social point of view. If the laws of the future are to be those of the past, it may be said that to have attained to too high a degree of intelligence and culture is what is most harmful to a people. Peoples perish as soon as the qualities of character which form the groundwork of their soul begin to decline, and these qualities decline as soon as the civilization and intelligence of a people reach a high level. Chapter 2. How institutions, religions, and languages are transformed. The superior races are as powerless as the inferior races to transform suddenly the elements of their civilization. Contradictions presented by the peoples which have changed their religions, languages, and arts. The example of Japan. In what respect these changes are only apparent. The profound transformations undergone by Buddhism, Brahmanism, Mahometanism, and Christianity, according to the various races by which they have been adopted. The variations undergone by institutions and languages, according to the race that adopts them. That the words which in different languages are considered to correspond represent very dissimilar ideas and modes of thought. Impossibility for this reason of translating certain languages. Why in books of history the civilization of a people sometimes seems to have undergone profound changes. Limits of the reciprocal influence of different civilizations. We have shown in a previous book that the superior races are wholly unable to induce inferior races to accept their civilization or to thrust it on them. Taking one by one the most powerful means of action at the disposal of Europeans, education, institutions, beliefs, we have proved their absolute inefficacy as means of changing the social state of the inferior peoples. We have endeavoured to establish that since all the elements of a civilization correspond to a certain well-defined mental constitution created by heredity in the course of the long past, it is impossible to modify them without changing the mental constitution of which they are the outcome. Such a task is beyond the power of conquerors, and can only be accomplished by the lapse of centuries. We have also shown that it is only by a series of successive stages analogous to those traversed by the barbarians who destroyed the Greco-Roman civilization that a people can rise in the scale of civilization. If it be sought by means of education to spare a people these stages, all that is done is to disorganize its morality and its intelligence and to reduce it in the end to a level inferior to that it would have reached if it had been left to itself. The arguments we have applied to inferior races are equally applicable to superior races. If the principles we have set forth in this work are correct, it ought to be clear that the superior races are also incapable of suddenly transforming their civilization. They too require time and need to traverse successive stages. If the superior peoples seem at times to have adopted beliefs, institutions, languages, and arts differing from those of their ancestors, they have done so in reality only after having slowly and profoundly transformed them so as to bring them into touch with their mental constitution. History appears to contradict on every page the preceding proposition. It offers us frequent examples of peoples changing the elements of their civilization, adopting new religions, new languages, new institutions, Some peoples abandon the beliefs they have held for centuries and are converted to Christianity, Buddhism, or Mahometanism. Others transform their language, yet others radically modify their institutions and their arts. It even seems that it rests with a conqueror or an apostle to provoke such transformations, or even that they result from a mere caprice. History, however, in offering these accounts of sudden revolutions, does no more than accomplish one of its habitual missions, the creation and propagation of enduring errors. When these alleged changes are closely studied, it is soon perceived that it is only the names of things that easily vary, whereas the realities hidden behind the words continue to exist and are only transformed with exceeding slowness. To prove this assertion, and to show at the same time how the slow evolution of things goes on behind denominations that remain unchanged, it would be necessary to study the elements of each civilization in the case of the different peoples, that is, to rewrite their history. I have already essayed this laborious task in several volumes. It will not be asked, in consequence, that I should again attempt it here. Leaving aside the numerous elements of which a civilization is composed, I shall choose but one of them as an example, the arts. Before approaching, however, in a special chapter, the study of the evolution accomplished by the arts in passing from one people to another, I shall make a few remarks respecting the changes undergone by the other elements of civilization, in order to show that the laws applicable to one of these elements are perfectly applicable to all of them, and that if the arts of the different peoples correspond to a certain mental constitution, as much as to be said of their languages, institutions, beliefs, etc., which in consequence cannot change suddenly and pass indifferently from one people to another. Footnote: I shall not deal here with the case of Japan, having already treated it elsewhere, while I shall certainly return to it on a future occasion. It would be impossible to study in a few pages a question on the subject of which eminent statesmen are the victims of delusions which are shared unfortunately by certain philosophers wanting in insight. The prestige adhering to military triumphs, even though achieved at the expense of mere barbarians, still remains for many minds the criterion of the level of civilization. It is possible to drill an army of Negroes in accordance with European military principles and to teach them to handle rifles and cannon, but their mental inferiority and the consequences it involves will not be modified on this account. The varnish of European civilization boasted at present by Japan in no wise corresponds to the mental condition of the race. It is a trumpery, borrowed garment which will soon be rent by violent revolutions. End of footnote. It is more especially in connection with religious beliefs that this theory may appear paradoxical, and yet it is precisely in the history of these very beliefs that the best examples are to be found in proofs that it is as impossible for a people suddenly to change the elements of its civilization as for an individual to alter his stature or the colour of his eyes. Nobody, doubtless, is ignorant that all the great religions, Brahmanism, Buddhism, Christianity, or Mahometanism, have provoked conversions en masse among entire races who have seemed to adopt them on a sudden. However, when a closer study is made of these conversions, it is soon observed that what the peoples have more especially changed is the name of their old religion, and not their religion itself, and that in reality the adopted beliefs have undergone the transformations necessary to bring them into touch with the old beliefs they have replaced, and of which in reality they are a mere continuation. The transformations undergone by beliefs in passing from one people to another are often indeed so considerable that the newly adopted religion has no longer any visible relationship with that of which it has kept the name. The best example is offered us by Buddhism, which, after having been transported into China, has become so unrecognizable that the learned took it at first to be an independent religion, and were a long time before they recognized that this religion was merely Buddhism transformed by the race that had adopted it. Chinese Buddhism is in no sort the Buddhism of India, itself very different from the Buddhism of Nepal, which in turn is sufficiently distinct from the Buddhism of Ceylon. In India, Buddhism was a schism from Brahmanism which preceded it, and from which at bottom it differed to no very great extent. In China it was also a schism from earlier beliefs to which it is closely related. The rigorous proof that is possible in the case of Buddhism is forthcoming as well in that of Brahmanism. The races of India being extremely varied, it was easy to presume that, under identical names, they would have extremely different religious beliefs. Doubtless all the Brahmanic peoples regarded Vishnu and Shiva as their principal divinities, and the Vedas and their sacred books. But of these fundamental gods the religion has retained but the name, and of the sacred books but the text. Around these central and common features have grown up innumerable cults, in which are found, according to the races, the most varied beliefs: monotheism, polytheism, fetishism, pantheism, the worship of ancestors, of demons, of animals, etc. Were the religions of India to be judged solely by what is found concerning them in the Vedas, not the least idea would be obtained of the gods and beliefs of the immense peninsula. The title of the sacred books is venerated by all the Brahmins, but there survives in general nothing of the religion taught by these books. Islamism itself, in spite of the simplicity of its monotheism, has not evaded this law. It is a far cry from the Islamism of Persia to that of Arabia and that of India. The Hindu, essentially a polytheist, has contrived to render polytheistic the most monotheistic of beliefs. For the 50 millions of Hindu Mahometans, Mahomet and the saints of Islam are scarcely more than new gods added to thousands of others. Islamism has ever been unable to establish in India that equality of all men which elsewhere was one of the causes of its success. The Mussulmans of India, like the other Hindus, practice the system of castes. In the Deccan, among the Dravidian populations, Islamism has become so unrecognizable that it can scarcely be distinguished from Brahmanism. Indeed, it would not be distinguished from it at all, but for the name of Mahomet and for the mosque where the Prophet, become a god, is worshipped. It is not necessary to go as far as India to observe the profound modifications undergone by Islamism in passing from one race to another. It suffices to consider our great possession, Algeria. It contains two very different races, Arabs and Berbers, both of them Mussulmans. The Islamism of the former is far removed from that of the latter. The polygamy of the Koran has become monogamy among the Berbers, whose religion is scarcely more than a fusion between Islamism and the old paganism practised by the race since the distant ages of Carthaginian rule. The religions of Europe themselves are not excepted from the common law which obliges beliefs to undergo a transformation in accordance with the soul of the races by which they are adopted. As in India, the letter of the dogmas fixed by the texts has remained invariable, but these dogmas are vain formulae of which each race interprets the meaning after its own fashion. Under the uniform denomination of Christians are found in Europe veritable pagans, such as the Basque Breton who worships idols, fetishists such as the Spaniard who adores amulets, polytheists such as the Italian who venerates as very different divinities the Madonnas of each village. Were this study to be prosecuted further, it would be easy to show that the great religious schism of the Reformation was the necessary consequence of the interpretation of one and the same religious book by different races. Those of the North, wishing to discuss their belief, regulate their life themselves, and those of the South, having remained far behind from the point of view of independence and the philosophic spirit, no example would be more convincing. These are facts, however, the development of which would lead us beyond our scope. We shall have to deal still more briefly with the two other fundamental elements of civilization, institutions and languages, because it would be necessary to enter into technical details that wholly surpass the limits of this work. What is true in the case of beliefs is equally true in that of institutions. These latter cannot be transmitted from one people to another without undergoing transformation. Not wishing to multiply examples, I beg the reader merely to consider how greatly, in modern times, the same institutions imposed by force or persuasion on different races have been transformed, though retaining identical names. I shall demonstrate the fact in a forthcoming chapter in connection with the different regions of America. Institutions are the outcome in reality of necessities on which the will of a single generation of men can have no action. For each race and for each phase of the evolution of that race, there are conditions of existence, sentiments, thoughts, opinions, hereditary influences, which imply certain institutions and do not imply others. The label a government bears is of very slight importance. It has never been accorded a people to choose the institutions which appear to it to be the best. Should some rare stroke of chance allow a people to choose its institutions, it will be unable to keep them. The numerous revolutions, the successive changes of constitution effected by the French during the last 100 years constitute an experience which should long since have settled the opinion of statesmen on this point. I believe, moreover, that it is scarcely elsewhere than in the obtuse brain of the masses and the narrow minds of some few fanatics that the idea can persist that important social changes are to be brought about by legislative acts. The only useful role of institutions is to give legal sanction to changes which manners and public opinion have ended by accepting. Institutions are moulded by these changes, but they are not in advance of them. The character and thought of men are not to be modified by institutions. It is not by institutions that a people is rendered religious or sceptical, or that it is taught to conduct its own affairs without incessantly demanding of the state that it shall forge it a chain. I shall not dwell on the question of languages any more than on that of institutions, and shall confine myself to drawing attention to the fact that even where a language is fixed by writing, it is necessarily transformed in passing from one people to another, a truth that renders so absurd the idea of a universal language. Doubtless the Gauls, in spite of their immense numerical superiority, had adopted the Latin language less than 2 centuries after their conquest. But they were quick to bring the newly adopted tongue into harmony with their needs and the logic peculiar to their bent of mind. Modern French is the final result of these transformations. It is impossible for different races to speak the same language for any length of time. The chances of conquest, the interests of its commerce may doubtless bring a people to adopt another language in the place of its mother tongue, but after the lapse of a few generations the language adopted will have been entirely transformed. The transformation will be the more thorough in proportion as the race from which the language has been borrowed is the more different from that which has borrowed it. Dissimilar languages are always certain to be met with in countries inhabited by different races. India affords an excellent example in point. The great peninsula being inhabited by numerous different races, it is not astonishing that 240 languages should, according to the linguistic authorities, be spoken in it, some of them differing more from each other than do French and Greek. These 240 languages do not include some 300 dialects. The widest spread among these languages is quite modern, since it has only existed for 3 centuries. It is Hindustani, a language formed by a combination of the Persian and Arabian spoken by the Mussulman conquerors and Hindi, one of the principal tongues of the invaded regions. Conquerors and conquered soon forgot their primitive language, exchanging it for a new language adapted to the needs of the new race produced by the interbreeding of the various peoples brought together. I cannot dwell longer on the matter and am obliged to confine myself to indicating the fundamental ideas. Were I able to enter into the necessary developments, I would go further and would say that where people are different, the words considered among them as corresponding represent modes of thinking and feeling so far apart that in reality their languages have no synonyms, and real translation from one language into the other is impossible. How wholly this is the case will be understood by observing how, in the same country and among the same race, the same word corresponds in the course of centuries to quite dissimilar ideas. Old words represent the ideas of the men of the past. Words which at their origin were the signs of real things soon have their meaning altered in consequence of changes in ideas, manners, and customs. Recourse is still had to these time-worn signs, for it would be too difficult to change them, but there is no correspondence between what they represented at a given moment and what they signify at the present day. In the case of peoples at a great distance from us, and whose civilizations were without analogy with our own, translations can only give words absolutely deprived of their real primitive sense, words, that is, evoking ideas in our minds which have no relation to those they formerly evoked. This phenomenon is especially striking in connection with the ancient languages of India. The ideas of the Indian people are indistinct, their logic has no relationship with our own, and their words have never had that precise and definite meaning which the lapse of centuries and the turn of our minds has ended by giving words in Europe. There are books, the Vedas for example, the translation of which, though it has been vainly attempted, is impossible. Footnote. Talking of the numerous attempts to translate the Vedas, an eminent Indian scholar, Mr. Barth, remarks, quote, "All these various and at times so contradictory investigations have one result. They demonstrate how impossible it is for us to make a translation, in the true sense of the word, of the Vedas." Unquote. End of footnote. It is difficult enough to penetrate the thought of the individuals with whom we live, but from whom we are separated by certain differences of age, sex, and education. To penetrate the thought of races on whom the dust of centuries has accumulated is a task no scholar will ever succeed in accomplishing. All the learning it is possible to acquire merely serves to show the complete uselessness of attempts of the kind. Brief and slightly developed though the preceding examples be, they suffice to show how profound are the transformations peoples effect in the elements of civilization they borrow. The importance of the elements borrowed often appears to be considerable, because the change in names is in fact sudden. This importance is in reality very slight. In the course of centuries, thanks to the slow labours of generations, and in consequence of successive additions, the borrowed element ends by differing greatly from the element from which it originally took the place. History, which takes note more especially of appearances, pays but little attention to these successive variations, and when it tells us, for example, that a people adopted a new religion, what we at once represent to ourselves is not at all the beliefs really adopted, but the religion such as we know it at the present day. It is necessary to study these slow adaptations with the utmost closeness in order to understand their genesis, and to detect the differences that separate words from realities. The history of civilizations is thus composed of slow adaptations, of slight successive transformations. If these latter appear to us to be sudden and considerable, it is because, as in geology, we suppress the intermediate phases and only consider the extreme phases. In reality, however intelligent and gifted a people be supposed to be, its capacity for absorbing a new element of civilization is always very restricted. The brain cells do not assimilate in a day what it has taken centuries to create, and what is adapted to the sentiments and needs of organisms that differ from one another. Only slow hereditary accumulations allow of such assimilations. Further on, when we come to study the evolutions of the arts among the most intelligent of the peoples of antiquity, the Greeks, we shall see that many centuries were necessary before the rude copies of Assyrian and Egyptian models were left behind, and after long successive stages those masterpieces were produced which are still the admiration of humanity. It must also be observed that all the peoples which have succeeded one another in history, with the exception of a few primitive peoples such as the Egyptians, the Chaldeans, have had little to assimilate beyond the elements of civilization which constitute the inheritance of the past. Elements they have transformed in accordance with their mental constitution. The development of the world's civilizations would have been infinitely slower, and the history of the various peoples would have been one eternal recommencement, if they had been unable to profit by the materials elaborated before their time. The civilizations created some 7,000 or 8,000 years ago by the inhabitants of Egypt and Chaldea have served as a store of materials to which all the nations have had recourse in turn. The arts of Greece owe their origin to the arts created on the banks of the Tigris and the Nile. The Grecian style gave birth to the Roman style, which, under the action of Oriental influences, has given birth to the Byzantine, Roman, and Gothic styles, styles which vary according to the genius and age of the peoples among whom they flourish, but styles that have a common origin. What we have just said in connection with the arts is applicable to all the elements of a civilization, institutions, languages, and beliefs. The European languages are derived from a mother tongue which was spoken in the past on the central plateau of Asia. French law is an offshoot of Roman law, itself the offshoot of earlier codes of law. The Jewish religion proceeds directly from the Chaldean beliefs. Associated with Aryan beliefs, it has become the great religion which for nearly 2,000 years has exerted its sway over the Western peoples. Our sciences themselves would not be what they are were it not for the slow labour of centuries. The great founders of modern astronomy, Copernicus, Kepler, and Newton, are the lineal descendants of Ptolemy, whose books retained their influence down to the 15th century, while Ptolemy descends through the Alexandrian school from the astronomers of Egypt and Chaldea. We thus get a glimpse, in spite of the formidable gaps of which history is full, of a slow evolution of our knowledge which takes us back through the successive ages and empires to the dawn of those ancient civilizations which modern science is attempting to link with the primitive times when humanity had no history. But if the source is common, the transformations, progressive or regressive, which each people effects according to its mental constitution in the elements it borrows are very varied, and it is the history of these transformations that constitutes the history of civilization. We have just seen that the fundamental elements of which a civilization is composed are peculiar to each people, that they are the result, the expression of its mental structure, and that in consequence they cannot pass from one race to another without undergoing the most profound changes. We have also seen that the extent of these changes is marked on the one hand by linguistic necessities, which oblige us to employ the same words to designate very different things, and on the other hand by historical necessities, which lead us to take into account only the extreme forms of a civilization, and to neglect the intermediary forms by which they are connected. When studying in the next chapter the general laws of the evolution of the arts, we shall be able to show with still greater precision the succession of the changes which take place in the fundamental elements of a civilization when they pass from one people to another. Chapter 3. How the arts are transformed. Application of the principles already set forth to the study of the evolution of the arts among the Oriental peoples. Egypt, the religious ideas from which its arts are derived. Developments that await its arts when they are transplanted amid different races. Ethiopians, Greeks and Persians. Primitive inferiority of Grecian art. Slowness of its evolution. Adoption and evolution in Persia of Grecian art. Egyptian art. The Assyrian art. The transformations undergone by the arts depend on the race and not on religious beliefs. Examples supplied by the great transformations undergone by Arabian art according to the races which have adopted Islamism. Application of our principles to the investigation of the origin and evolution of the arts in India. India and Greece went to the same sources, but in consequence of the diversity of the races, they developed arts having no relationship. Immense transformations undergone by architecture in India among the different races in spite of the similarity of their beliefs. In examining the relations between the mental constitution of a people, its institutions, its beliefs and its language, I have had to confine myself to brief indications. To elucidate such subjects it would be necessary to pile up volumes. In the case of the arts, a clear and precise statement is infinitely easier. Institutions and beliefs are matters whose definition is doubtful, whose interpretation is obscure. The reality which changes with every epoch has to be searched for in the ancient texts in which it lies concealed, and laborious argumentation and criticism must be resorted to in order to arrive at conclusions which, at the finish, are open to discussion. Works of art, and in particular monuments, are very definite objects and easy of interpretation. The books of stone are the most luminous of books, the only books that never lie, and it is for this reason that I have given them a preponderant place in my works on the history of the civilizations of the East. I have always held literary documents in the utmost suspicion. They are often deceptive and they rarely instruct. The monument rarely deceives and is always instructive. The monument is the best guardian of the thought of vanished peoples, and the mental blindness is to be pitied of the specialists who concern themselves solely with the inscriptions it may bear. Let us now proceed to study in what respect arts are the expression of the mental constitution of a people, and what are the transformations they undergo in passing from one civilization to another. In this inquiry I shall consider only the Eastern arts. The genesis and the transformation of the European arts have been subjected to identical laws, but to follow their evolution among the various races it would be necessary to enter into details which would be beyond the very restricted scope of this work. Let us take, to begin with, the arts of Egypt, and examine the destiny that awaited them among three different races among which they were successively transplanted, the Negroes of Ethiopia, the Greeks and the Persians. Of all the civilizations that have flourished on the globe, that of Egypt has found the most complete expression in the arts. It is expressed therein with such force and clearness that the artistic types that saw the light on the banks of the Nile could only be suitable to the Egyptians, and were not adopted by other peoples until they had been considerably transformed. The Egyptian arts, and more especially the Egyptian architecture, were the outcome of an ideal peculiar to the race, which for 50 centuries was the constant preoccupation of an entire people. The dream of the Egyptians was to create for man an imperishable dwelling in contrast with his ephemeral existence. This race, unlike in this respect to all other races, despised life and courted death. What interested it more than anything else was the motionless mummy, which, its eyes of enamel encrusted in its golden mask, gazed eternally from the depths of its gloomy resting place on mysterious hieroglyphics, guarded in its sepulchral dwelling vast as a palace against all profanation. The mummy was surrounded on the painted and sculptured walls of endless corridors by all that had charmed it during its brief terrestrial existence. Egyptian architecture is more especially a funereal and religious architecture, having more or less for its object the mummy and the gods. For them it is that the subterranean vaults were excavated, that the obelisks, the pylons, and the pyramids were raised, and for them that the pensive giants reclined on their thrones of stone in a pose so majestic and so harmonious. Everything about this architecture is stable and massive because it aimed at being eternal. If the Egyptians were the only people of antiquity with which we were acquainted, it would indeed be said that art is the most faithful expression of the soul of the race of which it is the creation. Peoples differing widely from one another, the Ethiopians, an inferior race, the Greeks and the Persians, superior races, have borrowed their arts either from Egypt alone or from Egypt and Assyria. Let us see what they became in their hands. Let us deal, to begin with the inferior people we have just mentioned, with the Ethiopians. It is known that at a late period in Egyptian history, that of the 24th dynasty, the peoples of the Sudan, taking advantage of the anarchy and decadence of Egypt, seized some of its provinces and founded a kingdom which, having Napata and Meroe successively for its capital, maintained its independence for several centuries. Dazzled by the civilization of the vanquished people, they endeavoured to copy their monuments and arts, but these copies of which we possess specimens are for the most part but very rude efforts. These Negroes were barbarians condemned by their mental inferiority never to shake off their barbarism, and in spite of the civilizing influence of the Egyptians, it is a fact that they never did shake it off. There is no example in ancient or modern history of a Negro people having reached a certain level of civilization, and on every occasion when a superior civilization, by one of those accidents which in ancient times occurred in Ethiopia and in modern times in Haiti, has fallen into the hands of the Negro race, this civilization has speedily reverted to wretchedly inferior forms. Under a very different latitude, another race, also barbarian at the time, but a white race, that of the Greeks, borrowed from Egypt and Assyria the first models of its arts, and confined itself at first to making crude copies. The artistic productions of these two great civilizations were furnished to the Greeks by the Phoenicians, who were masters of the sea routes that connect the shores of the Mediterranean, and by the peoples of Asia Minor, the masters of the land routes that led to Nineveh and Babylon. Everybody is aware how immeasurably the Greeks surpassed their models in the end. The discoveries of modern archaeology have shown, however, how rude were their first attempts, and that they required centuries before they came to produce the masterpieces which have made them immortal. The Greeks devoted some 700 years to this difficult task of converting a foreign art into a personal and superior art. But the progress realized during the last century is more considerable than that effected during all the preceding ages. It is not the superior stages of civilization, but the inferior stages that a people finds the most difficulty in surmounting. The most ancient productions of Greek art, those discovered at Mycenae and belonging to the 12th century before our era, point to entirely barbarian efforts, and are rude copies of Oriental objects. 6 centuries later, Greek art is still very Oriental. The Apollo of Tenea and the Apollo of Orchomenes bear a singular resemblance to the Egyptian statues. But the progress now becomes very rapid, and a century later we reach Phidias and the marvellous statues of the Parthenon. That is to say, an art that has thrown off the influence of the East, while it is very superior to the models to which it had gone so long for inspiration. Architecture followed a like evolution, though its successive steps are less easily established. We are ignorant of what the palaces of the Homeric poems, belonging to about the 9th century before our era, may have been like. But the bronze walls, the pinnacles brilliant with colour, the animals in gold and silver guarding the doors of which the poet tells us, make us think at once of the Assyrian palaces, covered with plates of bronze and enamelled bricks, and guarded by sculptured bulls. In any case, we know that the type of the most ancient Greek Doric columns, which seem to date from the 7th century, is met with in Egypt at Karnak and Beni Hassan, that several of the details of the Ionic column are borrowed from Assyria. But we also know that these foreign elements, to some extent superimposed at first, then blended and finally transformed, gave rise to new columns very different from their primitive models. At another extremity of the ancient world, Persia will offer us the example of an analogous adoption and evolution, though of an evolution that remained incomplete, because it was suddenly interrupted by foreign conquest. Persia did not have 7 centuries as Greece did, but only 200 years in which to create an art. So far, only one people, the Arabs, has been successful in giving birth to a personal art in so short a time. The history of Persian civilization scarcely begins before Cyrus and his successors, who succeeded 5 centuries before our era in taking possession of Babylon and Egypt, that is, of the 2 great cities of civilization whose glory illuminated at the time the Eastern world. The Greeks, who were to yield the supremacy in their turn, did not count as yet. The Persian Empire became the centre of civilization until 3 centuries before our era. It was overthrown by Alexander, whose conquest at once removed elsewhere the centre of the civilization of the world. Without an art of their own, the Persians, when they had possessed themselves of Egypt and Babylon, borrowed artists and models from the conquered countries. Their empire having lasted but 2 centuries, they did not have time to modify these arts profoundly. But at the moment of their overthrow they had already begun to transform them. The ruins of Persepolis, which are still standing, acquaint us with the genesis of these transformations. We doubtless meet in them with the fusion, or rather with the superposition, of the arts of Egypt and Assyria, mingled with some Greek elements. But new elements, notably the lofty Persepolitan columns with its bicephalous capitals, are already present, and authorize the belief that, if the Persians had disposed of a longer interval of time, this superior race would have created an art as personal, if not as lofty, as that of the Greeks. This supposition is supported by an examination of the monuments of Persia dating from a period 10 centuries later. To the dynasty of the Achaemenids, overthrown by Alexander, succeeded that of the Seleucids, then that of the Arsacides, and finally that of the Sassanids, overthrown in the 7th century by the Arabs. With the advent of these later conquerors, Persia acquired a new architecture, and when it again raises monuments, they offer an incontestable imprint of originality, the result of a combination of Arabian art with the ancient architecture of the Achaemenids, modified by its combination with the somewhat Grecian art of the Arsacides. Gigantic doorways taking in the entire height of the facade, enamelled bricks, ogival arcades, etc. It was this new art that the Mongols were to transport into India and to modify in their turn. In the preceding examples we see the varying degrees of transformation which a people can effect in the arts of another people, according to the race and to the time it has been able to devote to this transformation. In the case of an inferior race, the Ethiopians, although it had centuries at its disposal, we have seen that the borrowed art was made to return to an inferior form, the race being endowed with insufficient brain capacity. In the case of a race both superior and with centuries in which to operate, we have observed a complete transformation of the ancient art into a new and very superior art. In the case of another race, the Persians, not ranking so high as the Greeks, and who were limited in the matter of time, we have merely encountered great skill of adaptation and the beginnings of a transformation. Apart, however, from the examples, most of them distant, which we have just cited, there are many others more modern, of which the specimens are still standing, and which show the magnitude of the transformations a race is compelled to effect in the arts it borrows. These examples are the more typical, in that they are furnished by peoples professing the same religion, but of different origin. I refer to the Mussulmans. When the Arabs possessed themselves of the greater part of the old world in the 7th century of our era, and founded the gigantic empire which soon stretched from Spain to the centre of Asia and included the north of Africa, they found themselves in presence of a clearly defined architecture, the Byzantine architecture. At first they simply adopted it for the edification of their mosques both in Spain, Egypt and Syria. The Mosque of Omar at Jerusalem, that of Amrou at Cairo, and other monuments still standing show us this adoption. However, it did not last long, and in the various countries the monuments are seen to be transformed from century to century. We have shown the genesis of these changes in our "History of the Civilization of the Arabs." They are so considerable that there is no trace of resemblance between a monument of the early years of the conquest, such as the Mosque of Amrou at Cairo, 742, and one of the close of the great Arabian period, such as the mosque at Kate Bay, 1468. We have shown in our explanations and diagrams that, in the different countries subjected to the rule of Islam, Spain, Africa, Syria, Persia, India, the monuments present differences so considerable that it is really impossible to class them under the same denomination, as can be done, for example, in the case of the Gothic monuments, which, in spite of their varieties, offer evident analogies. These radical differences in the architecture of the Mussulman countries cannot be the result of diversity of beliefs, since the religion is the same. It is the result of racial divergences, whose influence on the evolution of the arts is as profound as it is on the destinies of empires. If this assertion is exact, we ought to expect to find very dissimilar monuments in a country inhabited by different races, even in the face of identical beliefs and unity of political domination. This is precisely the phenomenon that is observed in India. It is in India that it is easiest to find examples in support of the general principles set forth in this work, and it is for this reason that I am always referring to the great Peninsular, which constitutes the most suggestive and the most philosophic of books of history. At the present day it is the only country in which, merely by travelling from one spot to another, it is possible to go from age to age and to gaze on the still existing series of successive stages which humanity has had to traverse to reach the higher levels of civilization. All the forms of evolution are met with in India. The Stone Age has its representatives there, and so too has the age of electricity and steam. Nowhere can a better view be obtained of those great factors which preside over the genesis and evolution of civilizations. It is by applying the principles developed in the present work that I have attempted to solve a problem to which the key has long been sought: the origin of the arts of India. The subject being very little known and constituting an interesting application of our ideas on the psychology of races, we shall here sum up its most essential lines. Footnote: for technical details which cannot even be touched on here, I shall refer the reader to my work Les Monuments de l'Indie, one volume in folio, illustrated by 400 plates from my own photographs, plans and drawings. Didot. Many of these plates are given on a reduced scale in my work Les Civilisations dans l'Indie, 4to, 800 pages. End of footnote. As regards the arts, India does not make its appearance in history until very late. Its oldest monuments, such as the columns of Asoka, the temples of Karli, Bharhut, Sanchi, etc., scarcely date further back than 2 centuries before our era. When they were constructed, the majority of the old civilizations of the ancient world, those of Egypt, Persia and Assyria, even that of Greece itself, had terminated their cycle and entered the night of decadence. A single civilization, that of Rome, had replaced all the others. The world knew but one master. India, which emerged so tardily from the shadows of history, was in a position then to borrow much from anterior civilizations. The profound isolation, however, in which it was formerly admitted the country had always lived, and the astonishing originality of its monuments, which possess no visible relationship with any of those that had preceded them, long resulted in the hypothesis of borrowings from abroad being set aside. Side by side with their indisputable originality, the early Indian monuments display a superiority of execution which they were not destined to surpass in the lapse of centuries. Works of so high a degree of perfection had doubtless been preceded by long anterior tentative efforts. And yet, in spite of the most minute researches, no monument of an inferior order revealed the trace of these efforts. The recent discovery in certain isolated regions of the northwest of the peninsula of debris of statues and monuments clearly revealing Greek influences had ended by inducing Indian antiquarians to believe that India had borrowed its arts from Greece. The application of the principles set forth above and the most careful study of the majority of the monuments still existing in India have led us to quite a different conclusion. India, in our opinion, in spite of its accidental contact with Greek civilization, borrowed none of its arts from Greece, and could not borrow any of them from this source. The differences between the two races were too great. Their thought was too unlike, their artistic geniuses were too incompatible for them to have influenced one another. The examination of the ancient monuments scattered over India shows, moreover, immediately that there is no relationship between its arts and those of Greece. Whereas our European monuments are full of elements borrowed from Grecian art, the monuments of India present absolutely no such elements. The most superficial study proves that we are in presence of extremely different races, and that geniuses more unlike, I would even say more antipathetic, have never perhaps existed than the Greek genius and the Hindu genius. This general notion is merely accentuated when a more thorough and penetrating study is made of the monuments of India and of the inner psychology of the peoples that created them. It is soon observed that the Hindu genius is too personal for it to undergo a foreign influence at variance with its thought. Doubtless such a foreign influence can be imposed by force, but however long it may be supposed to last, it remains exceedingly superficial and transitory. It would seem as if between the mental constitution of the peoples of India and that of other peoples there were barriers as great as the formidable obstacles created by nature between the great peninsula and the other countries of the globe. The Hindu genius is so specific that whatever be the object necessity obliges it to imitate, the object is immediately transformed and becomes Hindu. Even in architecture, where it is nevertheless difficult to conceal borrowings, the personality of this strange genius, this faculty of rapid modification, is quick to reveal itself. It is possible, no doubt, to make a Hindu architect copy a Greek column, but he will not be prevented from transforming it rapidly into a column which at first sight will be said to be Hindu. Even at the present day, though European influence is now so powerful in India, such transformations are daily observable. If a Hindu artist be given any European model to copy, he will adopt its general form, but he will exaggerate certain parts and multiply and disfigure the ornamental details, so that the second or third copy will have dropped all the Western characteristics and will have become exclusively Hindu. The fundamental characteristic of Hindu architecture, a characteristic also found in Hindu literature, which for this reason is closely allied to Hindu architecture, is an overflowing exaggeration, an infinite richness of detail, a complexity which is the very antipodes of the correct and severe simplicity of Grecian art. It is more especially in studying the arts of India that it is understood to what an extent the plastic works of a race are often allied to its mental constitution, and constitute the clearest of languages for those who know how to interpret them. If the Hindus, like the Assyrians, had entirely disappeared from history, the bas reliefs of their temples, their statues, their monuments, would suffice to reveal to us their past. What they would tell us in particular is that the clear and methodic genius of the Greeks had never been able to exercise the slightest influence on the overflowing and unmethodical imagination of the Hindus. They would also make us understand why the Grecian influence in India could never be other than transitory, and was always limited to the region in which it was momentarily imposed by force. The study from an archaeological point of view of the monuments of India has enabled us to confirm by precise documents what is revealed immediately by a general knowledge of India and the Hindu genius. It has enabled us to establish the curious fact that on several occasions, notably during the first 2 centuries of our era, the Hindu sovereigns, in communication with the Arsacides dynasty of Persia, whose civilization bore a strong Grecian impress, desired to introduce Grecian art into India, but never succeeded in making it take root. This borrowed and wholly official art, which bore no relation to the thought of the people among whom it had been introduced, always disappeared with the political influences that had given birth to it. Moreover, it was too antipathetic to the Hindu genius to have exerted any influence on the national art, even during the period during which it was imposed by force. No traces of Greek influence are found in the contemporary or posterior Hindu monuments, in the subterranean temples, for example. On the other hand, they would be far too easily discerned for it to be possible to pass them over. Apart from the general aspect which is always characteristic, there are technical details, the treatment of the draperies in particular, which at once reveal the hand of a Greek artist. The disappearance of Greek art in India was as sudden as its apparition, and this very suddenness shows how entirely it was an imported art, officially imposed but without affinity with the people that had been obliged to accept it. Arts never disappear in this way from amongst a people. They transform themselves, and the new art always borrows something from that of which it has taken the place. After suddenly appearing in India, Greek art as suddenly disappeared without exerting any influence whatever, exactly as has been the case with the European monuments erected in the country by the English during the past 2 centuries. The fact that at the present day the European arts exert no influence in India may be compared with the exceeding slightness of the influence of the Greek arts there 18 centuries ago. It cannot be denied that we have here a case of incompatibility of aesthetic sentiments, for the Mussulman arts, although quite as foreign to India as the European arts, have been imitated throughout the peninsula. Even in those parts of the country where the Mussulmans have never exercised any power, it is rare to come across a temple that does not contain some traces of Arabian ornamentation. Doubtless, as in the distant times of King Kanishka, we see Rajas at the present day, such as the Raja of Gwalior, attracted by the might of the foreigners, build themselves European palaces in the Greco-Latin style. But again, as in the time of Kanishka, this official art, superposed on the indigenous art, is totally without influence on the latter. Greek and Hindu art, then, formerly existed side by side, like European art and Hindu art at the present day, but without ever influencing one another. So far as the monuments of India, properly so called, are concerned, there is not one of them of which it can be said that it offers either in its general aspect or in its details any resemblance whatever, however remote, with a Greek monument. This powerlessness of Grecian art to implant itself in India is striking, and it must needs be attributed to the incompatibility we have pointed out between the soul of the 2 races, and not to a sort of incapacity native to India to assimilate a foreign art, for the country has shown itself perfectly able to assimilate and transform the arts that correspond to its mental constitution. The archaeological documents that we have been able to collect show that Persia was the source from which India derived its arts, not the slightly Hellenized Persia of the time of the Arsacides, but the Persia that had inherited the old civilizations of Egypt and Assyria. It is known that when Alexander overthrew the dynasty of the Achaemenides 330 BC, the Persians had already been in possession for 2 centuries of a brilliant civilization. Doubtless they had not discovered the formula of a new art, but the mixture of the arts of Egypt and Assyria, which they had inherited, had produced remarkable works. We can judge them by the still existing ruins of Persepolis, which show us by their Egyptian pylons, their Assyrian winged bulls, and even some Grecian elements, that all the arts of the great anterior civilizations had mingled their influences in this limited region of Asia. India then borrowed its arts from Persia, but it borrowed them in reality from the sources to which Persia itself had gone, from Chaldea and Egypt. The study of the monuments of India reveals the borrowings on which they lived originally, but to establish these borrowings the most ancient monuments must be examined, for the Hindu genius is so specific that the borrowed elements, in order to adapt themselves to it, undergo such transformations that they soon become unrecognizable. Why is it that India, which has shown itself so incapable of borrowing anything whatever from Greece, has shown itself, on the contrary, so disposed to borrow from Persia? The reason evidently is that the Persian arts correspond to its mental structure, whereas there was no such correspondence in the case of the arts of Greece. The simple forms and the sparely ornamented surfaces of the Grecian monuments could not appeal to the Hindu genius, which was attracted, on the contrary, by the complicated forms, the exuberant decoration, and the wealth of ornament of the Persian monuments. Moreover, it is not solely at this distant epoch, anterior to our era, that Persia, representing Egypt and Assyria, exerted an influence on India by its arts. When many centuries later the Mussulmans appeared in the peninsula, their civilization during its passage through Persia had been deeply imbued with Persian elements, and it brought to India in reality a Persian art still bearing traces of those old Assyrian traditions which had been continued by the dynasty of Achaemenids. The gigantic doorways of the mosques, and especially the enamelled bricks with which the mosques are lined externally, are vestiges of the Chaldeo-Assyrian civilization. India was able to assimilate these arts so well because they were in accordance with the genius of its race, whereas Greek art in the past and European art at the present day, being utterly opposed to its mode of thinking and feeling, have always remained without influence on the national productions. It is not, then, with Greece, as the archaeologists still maintain, but with Egypt and Assyria, through the medium of Persia, that India is linked. India has borrowed nothing from Greece, but both have gone to the same sources, to that common treasure, the foundation of all civilizations, brought into being in the course of centuries by the peoples of Egypt and Chaldea. The borrowings of Greece were effected through the medium of the Phoenicians and of the peoples of Asia Minor, those of India through the medium of Persia. The civilizations of Greece and India hark back in this way to a common source, but the currents that issued from this source in the two countries speedily took very different directions, in harmony with the genius of either race. If, however, as we have asserted, the art of a race is in close correspondence with its mental constitution, and if for this reason the same art, borrowed by dissimilar races, at once assumes very different forms, we should expect to find that India, a country inhabited by a great variety of races, is in possession of very different arts, and of styles of architecture that bear no resemblance to one another, in spite of the identity of beliefs. An examination of the monuments of the different regions of India shows how entirely this is the case. Indeed, the differences between the monuments are so profound that the only classification of the monuments we have been able to make is based on regions, that is, on racial distinctions, and is quite independent of the religion to which the peoples who have constructed them have belonged. There is no analogy between the monuments of the north of India and those of the south, constructed though they were at the same period by peoples professing a similar religion. Even during the Mussulman domination, at a period, that is, when the political unity of India was most complete and the influence of the central authority at its maximum, the purely Mussulman monuments present profound differences according to the region in which they are found. The mosques of Ahmedabad, Lahore, Agra, and Bijapur, although devoted to the same cult, offer but a very slight relationship, a much slighter relationship than that which connects a monument of the Renaissance with those of the Gothic period. It is not architecture only that varies in India according to the race. The statuary also varies with the different regions, not merely as regards the types represented, but especially in respect to the way in which they are treated. If the bas-reliefs or the statues of Sanchai be compared with those of Bharhut, with which they are nevertheless contemporary, the difference is already manifest. It is plainer still when the statues and bas-reliefs of the province of Orissa are compared with those of Bundelkund, or again the statues of Mysore with those of the great pagodas of the south of India. The influence of race is everywhere apparent. It is seen, moreover, in the most trifling artistic productions, which, as everybody is aware, differ immensely in India from one region to another. It is not necessary to be very expert to distinguish between a coffer in carved wood of Mysore workmanship and a coffer that hails from the Gujarat district, or between a jewel from the province of Orissa and a jewel from that of Bombay. Doubtless the architecture of India, like all Oriental architecture, is principally religious, but however great religious influence may be, especially in the East, the influence of race is much more considerable. The soul of the race which guides the destinies of peoples determines as well their beliefs, institutions and arts. Whatever be the element of civilization under consideration, its action is always perceptible. It is the only force against which no other force can prevail. It represents the dead weight of thousands of generations, the synthesis of their thought.